So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to start in a few seconds at 5 minutes past the hour. And with us today is Ying Hua from the Institute of Culture and Society, and she's a PhD student finishing off, and James Avanitakis, who is a professor at the School of Humanities and Communications Arts. I used to be a professor at the Institute of Culture and Society. I used to be Dean and PVC Research of HDR students. And go, James, I think you should take on introducing yourself, if you can, please.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is James Avanitakis, and for those of you who I don't know, I was the Dean of Graduate Studies and helped set up the Graduate Research School, then the Pro Vice Chancellor of Research and Graduate Studies. I've supervised about 10 PhD students to completion, and I think 2 Masters of Philosophy MPhils as well. So, and I used to do a lot of honours supervision as well. I'm actually yet to supervise an MRes student, would you believe? No one's ever asked me. So, yeah, I love supervision. I was also on the executive of the Australian Council for Graduate Research. I'm really interested in best practice for supervision, but also in making the PhD journey as both fulfilling and enjoyable as possible. And I know these are tough times for the higher education sector, but it doesn't mean that we can't deal with them with a sense of humanity and compassion, integrity and solidarity. So that's why we do these things, to sort of share our experiences and hopefully make your journey as enjoyable as possible. So should I begin? Yep. Okay, so we're going to start. This is, I can't remember which one this is. This is the 4th or the 5th one that we've done of these. I really love doing them. And before we begin, I want to just take a moment to acknowledge where the land in which this amazing university is placed and where we all are sitting. I'm at the moment on the Madigal people of the Eora Nation, and for those of you who don't know the history of Australia, the sort of pre-settlement Australia, this is the many nations of Aboriginal people that lived on this land, and it's a very long and proud history, and one that we should acknowledge and celebrate and build our wisdom from. We've been doing these now for about, I think we do them every 2 weeks. I think this is the 5th one we've done, even possibly the 6th one, I'm not sure, but I love doing them. And the main reason I do them is because the culture of research is one of the hardest things to understand, in the sense of there's, the way that we do research in Australian universities is different to how you do research elsewhere. And if you're a new PhD student and you've come from elsewhere, you need to learn that culture. And so, and also as supervisors, we are rarely taught to be supervisors formally. We learn how to be supervisors by the way that we're supervised. And so we learn some good strategies, but we also pick up some bad habits from our supervisors. So this is a chance for us to discuss both your experience and also about supervision as well. So the rules are simple. I usually start with a presentation, and then from there we take some Q&As, some specific Q&As as well as some general Q&As. I am always honest in what I say, and I just expect everyone to be respectful in their interactions as we interact. Halfway through, we'll be taking a survey to see what are some of the key issues on your mind, and I think we've got 2 more of these planned. And then after that, I'm open to take if anyone wants to suggest any areas I want me to cover, I'm happy to cover those. Or if we just want to make this a bit more of a general Q&A session, let me know. So let's begin. So today I want to talk about what happens when things go wrong in your research, in your PhD or your master's. I'll generally use the term PhD. I'll keep on saying PhD, but I think the lessons of what we have are relevant for both the masters and the PhD. So the important thing to say is this is what we imagine our journey to look like when we begin our PhD. Usually we sit there and think that, in the first year we'll do our reading, in the second year we'll do our field work, and in the third year we'll do our writing. Then we always expect this linear journey, but the truth is that our journey looks much more like this. Things go wrong, we go backwards, we make progress, and then something goes wrong again, and then we learn from that mistake. The important thing to recognize, this will happen. Not everybody has very, very few people have a mistake-free or a drama-free PhD or master's journey. The important thing is not to make the same mistakes twice and to learn from your mistakes. So the important thing then is to begin by saying something will always go wrong. Something somewhere will always go wrong. And this could be a combination of your case study falling apart, personal, professional things happen all the time, and so I'll discuss, I think, some of the things that I've seen go wrong and some strategies around those. But before I do, I want to just say, give you 5 things things not to do if things go wrong. And like I said, if I go back to this slide and I go, as you're progressing and things go backwards, then we need to expect and accept that will happen. But these are 5 things not to do. And the first one is to hide. And I remember when I was doing my PhD, I was talking to a friend of mine who was also doing her PhD with me. And as I was talking to her, she was walking, we're in the PhD lab, and we were walking. And as we were talking, she started walking backwards away from me. And then she actually hid behind the photocopier or the printer. She hid behind the printer, and I said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "I'm hiding from my supervisors." And so the first thing that happens when things don't go quite right, we often hide. We often want to deny it, and we often hide. So that's one thing you should definitely not do. And following on from that is you shouldn't avoid your supervisors. In fact, when things go wrong, the first people you should turn to is to your supervisors and outline what it is that's gone wrong and why it's gone wrong. And this is really important. And before we spoke about managing your panel, and if you employ those strategies that we talked about then, and if you missed that session, then I encourage you to have a look at it. Then you should be turning to your supervisors for support, not avoiding your supervisors. The third thing not to do is to isolate yourself or ignore emails. Again, when things aren't going quite right, sometimes we just want to turn off from the world. And if you need to do that, you do that for a day, you do that for half a day, you might even do it for a weekend. Because you can't always be working, and I'll be talking about that in a little bit. But again, isolating yourself or ignoring the world isn't going to assist you in sort of setting things right. And this is important, and because the PhD research and master's research can often be really isolating. You can feel isolated, and that's one of the biggest challenges that we have. And you should never isolate yourself. You should never make things worse. And so, you might not want to approach your supervisor straight away, but one of the things you may want to do is go to one of your friends or your colleagues, a fellow PhD student, and talk to them about what the problem is. So the worst thing you can do is isolate yourself, ignore emails coming in from the GRS or other parts of the university. Like I said, it's okay to take a day or 2 off, but you need to not put it off, because the longer you put it off, the harder it is to get back and try and solve what the issues are. The next thing to say is you shouldn't blame everybody else. Things go wrong, and we're human, and we all make mistakes. And I think it's really important to recognize that we make mistakes, and sometimes, yeah, it is things beyond your control, and other times it is you know, mistakes that you've made. And you know, I made lots of mistakes during my PhD, and I learned from them. But part of learning from mistake is to recognize that I was human, I was fallible, I make mistakes, and I was ready to accept them and own them. And that, I think, made me a better researcher. And so, you know, and it's best to admit the mistake early on than to try and hide the mistake or cover it up. I know of situations in labs, for example, where people have made errors and they've tried to cover up those errors, and that then later on, you know, 6 months later or a year later, the errors were identified and the mistakes and the cover up made it look like the person tried to falsify information. So you know, you need to kind of be able to stop, take ownership, and decide then, okay, how do I learn from this and go forward? And what I will say is, when I was the Dean of Graduate Studies, one of my roles was to investigate academic misconduct and research misconduct. And we never, at that time, when I investigated, no one was ever in trouble for making a mistake. What people were in trouble for was trying to cover things up. And it's important that as we as researchers recognize that any mistake can be discussed and solved. What is deeply problematic is when you try and cover things up. Okay. So, and the fifth thing is to automatically think that changing your panel will solve all your problems. There is a time and a place to change your panel, to change members of your panel, to maybe change your main supervisor, but that is not, if things are going wrong, you first need to understand why things are going wrong before you should even contemplate changing your panel. And that is a totally different conversation. As a Dean of Graduate Studies, I was always hesitant to change someone's panel when things went wrong. And what I found was that if I changed someone's panel very quickly, if I changed someone's panel, that often they would then ask for another change pretty quickly after that, because then they realize that, you know, you can't solve problems by just changing panels. That does not say that there are not times you need to change a panel, but that is something that you shouldn't do straight away. It's a big change. If you're changing direction, or, you know, there's serious issues with your panel, then that's one thing. But you know, you shouldn't automatically think that's going to solve your problems. I noticed someone raised their hand. Alexa, do you want to take any questions or anything like that, or should I keep on going?
I think it's best to keep on going, and then we will resolve questions during question time, if that's okay.
Okay, cool. Okay.
If everyone can put their questions in the Q&A, then we can actually manage them. So thank you so much.
Thanks. All right, so let's talk about what can go wrong. So I want to talk about 7 things that frequently go wrong during the PhD journey. And I'm sure that if Alexi and his supervised and others who are going through this can probably identify others, but these are 7 common things that I see, that I've seen, and I've had to try and rectify, working with both my students, but then working with other students as the Dean. So the first thing that often happens is that we lose direction. You know, you got to remember that a PhD or a master's, it's the biggest project most of us will have done in our lives at that time. You know, some people come to a PhD after or during a significant career or at the end of their career, and you know, might be project managers, so they might be used to handling big projects. But for us, for most of us, our PhD it comes at a time in our lives where you know, this is the biggest project we're taking on. It's a 3-year project. It's got a lot of moving parts. Depending on your case study or your research focus, you often rely on other people, and it's easy to lose direction. And this often happens, most frequently happens around your 2nd year or during your 2nd year. And this is where I think, the first year is kind of, in a way, you're very enthusiastic, you're very focused, you work towards your confirmation of candidature, you get that out of the way, and then you got to go and begin to really make progress on your research. And that's where you're starting to try and make that progress, is where it's easy to sort of get caught in, go down different rabbit holes or rabbit warrens, or to go somewhere that's in a different direction. And then all of a sudden you start concentrating on there. And then before you know it, you're like, hang on, what am I researching? It's easy to forget what you're researching. So this is, so what are the solutions? Well, the first solution is to definitely go back to your research questions. And in fact, my advice is always, whenever you have your draft research questions in the first year, and they're solidified in the second year when you do your confirmation of candidature, and they may evolve even further as you progress. But my advice is have those research questions handy. And whenever you're reading something, or whenever you're beginning to do case study work, or prepare an experiment, you should be asking yourself the simple question: is this getting me closer to answering my research questions? They're your ultimate guidance, right? Because it's your research questions which your PhD or your research project, master's or PhD, will be assessed on. When the examiner looks at it, they're going to look at the research questions, and they're going to look at your position with what you've put forward, and they will ask themselves two questions: A, have they answered the research question that they've set out? And B, have they made an original contribution to their intellectual field? And if they answer yes to both those questions, then you will be passed for your PhD. Now, when I'm examining PhDs, one of the things I always do is I always mark where the research questions are. And I'll often, when I'm reading a chapter, I'll always go back and usually you read a couple of chapters, leave it, read another couple of chapters. But whenever I start to reread the thesis, to re-examine it, I always look at the research questions. So it's really important that you get them right and always go back to them. If you are feeling lost and you're not sure where you've gone wrong, then one of the things I do is that in most research papers is I go back to the research questions, then I start looking at everything I've done so far, and start breaking it down into parts. So you almost form I do like a series of post-it notes where I say, okay, this was my literature review. Did it get me close to my research questions? Yes, it did. Okay, so that has to stay. This was my case study. Okay, did that get me closer to my research questions? Actually, no, my case study was taking me somewhere away. Okay, what do I do now? Do I go back and do a new case study? Do I go back and redraft my research questions? What is it that I need to do? And so you need to break it down like that and start thinking about where it's gone wrong. Some people work forwards, other people work backwards, but it's important to try and break things down so you can identify where things have gone wrong. Does that make sense? Alexi, thumbs up? Cool. Okay, so the next one is a case study falls apart, and this is more frequent than what we think. For those of you who are doing any research at the moment with COVID, will understand what that means specifically, but often it can be a whole bunch of things that can happen. That can see your case study fall apart. It could be your results could be contaminated. There's a whole bunch of things that happen. And again, if this happens, the first thing you need to do is the first thing you need to do is speak to your supervisors and see what can be done. Now, depending on your research field, sometimes you can learn a lot from those mistakes, and actually you can use that as a drop-off point to another case study. Or sometimes you can use it as to say, okay, well, this case study went wrong and it's part of your thesis. You say, this is why it went wrong. And from that, I learned this and I've developed now this methodology. So that's actually quite important. So again, the first thing you should do is not just assume that if something goes wrong in your case study, then everything has to be thrown out. You should look at it and think, well, what valuable insight have I gained from that? And what do I, what can I incorporate? Do I incorporate some of that? Depending on the timing of your thesis, you might have you might undertake a new case study or a new experiments. Alternatively, as I've seen happen before, is that people have had to recalibrate what they're going to do. So they might then say, well, look, I was originally going to do this more in-depth analysis. But what I'm going to do now of a case study, but what I want to do now is concentrate more on the theoretical focus of my work, and use my case study is now going to play a smaller part of what I wanted my thesis to be. So, you know, these things happen, and COVID highlights how it can happen in a big scale, but it can also happen on a small scale. And again, think about what you can learn, think about what you can take away, and think about how you can refocus. Okay, this is something that happened to me when I was doing my thesis. About 2 months from completion, a book was released by two very famous authors that essentially covered everything that I was saying in my thesis. I did quite a theoretically heavy thesis with some small case studies, and the book that was released came out, I think, in about 3 months where I was due to submit. So in many ways, I had already put my bits and my paper together, and I was just editing it through. And I realised that if I submitted my thesis as planned in 3 months' time, any examiner who was familiar with this area would turn around and say, "Well, hang on, but you haven't even referred to this book." The book was called The Commonwealth. And so, then the first thing I did was I lay on the ground and sucked my thumb and cried for about an hour, and threw a tantrum. And then I got up and I read the book from cover to cover. And then what I did was I used that as a way to put a frame around what I was doing in the opening, and then sort of saying, well, you know, this book's an important contribution, and this is my departure. So then I focused on the areas that weren't covered exactly. So it was quite similar, but there was parts that were different enough for me to be able to extend. And so I did have to redraft and reshift the focus, and that probably added an additional 3 months to my submission date. Again, these things are out of your control. So again, if this does happen, think about what you can incorporate. Think about what you can leverage off the findings or arguments, and as I did, speak to your supervisors. And you know, my supervision panel agreed that, you know, I came back to them, and you know, I really took ownership of this, and I cannot emphasize enough that you should look for solutions, you know, when you go to your panel. So I went to my panel and I said, okay, these are my key messages. This is the key messages from the Commonwealth. This is where I think I'm different. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to redraft the introduction plus the chapters 4 and 5 and focus on where I separate. And so what I ended up doing when I did that was I talked about the book quite heavily, but then in the opening section, I talked about it heavily, incorporated into my literature review, and then talk about, well, this thesis is a departure from that on these 3 key areas, and sort of listed those key areas and just really expanded that section. So it does happen, you know, it doesn't mean that you throw everything out. It just means that you think about, well, again, what is it that I'm doing that I can contrast or I can build upon, and so on. I hope that makes sense. Alexi, good? Yep. Okay, all right, so moving on. Oops. Okay, so this is an important one, lose enthusiasm and focus. And this is also, I mean, I didn't put this down, but I, you know, probably should have, is also when you're just feeling down, you know, it's an emotionally exhausting process, and it does create a whole bunch of emotional and physical exhaustion. And including, you know, people, you know, go through when they suffer from insomnia, they can suffer from depression, and a whole bunch of other things that happen. And they're tough days, right? They're tough days. And again, this is why I say what I said at the beginning, is you should never hide. If you're feeling down, or if you're feeling like you've lost enthusiasm, or if you're feeling depressed, you know, you're sad, the last thing you need to do is just lock yourself away. You know, this is where you seek help, you seek support, and your networks, your professional networks at the university, as well as your supervisors, as well as your you know, your friends that you're doing your PhD journey with. That's where you really need to turn to and speak to them. And the guide that I always used, you know, for me was, and you know, and I've like most people in the world at some point, I've suffered from depression. And one of the things the guide I always used was, I said, okay, am I feeling down because something has gone wrong? Right? And if that's the case, then okay, then it's not, I'm feeling, okay, something's gone wrong, so I'm feeling down. That makes sense, I'm feeling down. Or am I just feeling down because I'm feeling down? And if I was feeling down just because I was feeling down, that's when they set off warning signals in my head, and I sought support and help. So just be really conscious of your emotions, and I think it's really important that we're honest about it, and never feel alone. So look, about enthusiasm and focus, what's really important is you got to remember this is a 3-year project, so it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. So what I always say is you're better off doing some work every day. If you're a full-time student, I used to work from 7 a.m. till 3. That was my work day. And then after 3 o'clock, I would stop, because that was all I knew I was capable of. I work really well in the morning. I don't work well in the afternoon or evening. So that was the best time for me to work. I had friends that worked from 4 till midnight. They would start at 4 p.m. and they would, work till midnight, then, go home, eat, watch bad television, and then fall asleep, and then get up next morning, go for a run, and then start work at 4. So you have to work what works for you. But you should always remember that you're in for a long haul, and this is why you need to set goals and important sort of important milestones like the confirmation of candidature, but smaller goals to lead up. So what I recommend is that every Sunday I used to sit down and set my goals for the week. They were realistic, they were achievable. But they also challenged me. Each goal challenged me, and so as I did that, I would reward myself, and in part of that rewarding was to take planned time off. So if you do your work, say, and you work through until Friday and you achieve your goals, then there's nothing better than having a weekend off, right? But if you procrastinate and don't get through those goals, then you will get dispirited, and then if you take time off, you feel guilty. And like I said, there's nothing wrong with taking planned time off. Planned time off is really, really important. And part of that is finding a balance between your health, time with your friends and family, and your research, those 3 things. And I know that for me, the health and family part were just as important as my research, and I made sure that I maintained the balance. Sure, there were some days where you had a deadline and you worked really long hours, and maybe over the weekend, and that happens. But there are times, but there should be times where you also get to have some downtime as well. And no one can work 24 hours, 7 days a week for 3 years. It's just not possible. We're not machines. And if you try that, then you will lose direction. Your mental health is likely to suffer, and you will lose focus and enthusiasm. So again, think about it as, break it down, reward yourself, take some planned time off, and stay energized and focused. And if you do that, then I think you'll remain, your enthusiasm will continue. Okay, the next one is to have issues with your panel. This can go wrong, and we talked about this last time. We talked about what can things that about managing your panel. And look, this is an important one. And we talked a lot about managing your panel is about honesty and transparency. And again, we talked about how the best ways to do that. I won't go through that ground again, but just remember that that you need to, there are people to support you. There's, your students around you, other PhD candidates. There's a HDI director or the Associate Dean of Research you can seek advice from, and you can speak to them confidentially and informally or formally as you choose, but it's always in confidence. If there are things that are starting to happen, like if you're finding that you have certain concerns, then my suggestion is you raise them early. For example, if for example your panel keeps on cancelling on you, then you need, cancelling meetings on you, then you need to sort of turn around and say, hey, look, I noticed that you cancelled the last few meetings. I'm a bit worried because I kind of really need your help for this next section. So can we really make sure that the next panel goes ahead, because I'm starting to stress. So being honest and making sure that you identify those issues early and raise them. And you know, I always say, remember that your panel, you are one person in your supervisor's life. They have their own research projects, their teaching, their administration work, and also other potential PhDs and master's students. So they do, you know, sometimes manage their time badly. And so a lot of it is, you know, most of it is not sinister. Most of it is just probably bad time management on their part. But if you have concerns, you know, don't let them upset you. You know, raise them in a respectful way. And again, speak to someone and say, hey, do you think I'm being crazy here? I'm feeling a little bit like I'm being neglected. Do you think I'm being crazy? Yeah. So just yeah, I can talk more about that as well if you have some time. Just conscious of the time. Okay, the next part is to do something, the next part of your thesis, which is the part that's required, but you don't want to do it. So they're all things, everybody has things that they love doing and things that they hate doing, you know. For example, friends of mine who work in labs, in wet labs, they love doing the experiments, they hate doing the writing, okay? And so what they do is they jump in, they do all the experiments, and then the next time they go and do the experiments, the next day they do the experiments, and then, you know, 3 months later they've done all the experiments, and then somebody says, okay, now you got to write up those experiments, and they're like, oh, that's the worst. I don't want to do that. And they look back and they think, oh, that's 3 months worth of writing up I have to do. That's a terrible way to do it. You should be writing every day. And so, you know, there are things that we hate doing, and we should just remember that that we do need to confront those things. And so, so if you're a person that doesn't like writing, then you got to make sure that you just put an hour aside to write. If you're a person who doesn't like doing sort of face-to-face interviews, but that's a core part of your thesis, then you'll have to, you know, discipline yourself to make those appointments, plan ahead, plan well, and undertake those interviews. So just be aware that we all have things that we don't like doing. We all have strengths and weaknesses. It's easy to play to your strengths. It's harder to confront your weaknesses. But my advice is don't procrastinate. Draw up a plan, and when you manage to do some of those things that you've wanted to put off, then you make sure that you reward yourself again with time off, or you know what I do, which is eat some ice cream. It's a small reward, but it's one that makes me very, very happy. Okay, and then finally, writing. Writing is something that is the issue that that people find the hardest. Most people find the hardest for a lot of you know, people who work in the STEM disciplines. Writing is the one thing that they feel that doesn't come as naturally to them, and they procrastinate doing it. And a friend of mine who was telling me that at her university that's when they lose the most number of STEM students is at the end of second year, because in the first year they've done a lot of their background research. In the second year that they are doing all their experiments and going really well. And then what they've done is they haven't kept up with writing. And so then they sit down to do all their writing in one slot, and they get despondent, discouraged, and frustrated. And so what they then do is they end up dropping out. So my advice to you is write a little bit every day. Write, you know, even if it's not something that comes natural to you, make sure that you write. Writing is thinking. If you can sometimes think that sometimes you think that that you know something, but actually until you write it down and start drawing it out, then you don't really know if you know it, right? If it doesn't make sense on paper, and it then means that you got nothing to examine. If it's not written down on paper, then what's someone going to examine? So make sure that, you know, obviously different disciplines have different requirements, but you know, make sure that you work on that a little bit every day. All right. So yeah, write as you go. My advice is join writing circles or shut up and write sessions. Dr. Susan Mowbray from the Graduate Research School, she does amazing work in this area, and she's one for really great advice. And make sure you stay on top of this. So that's it from me. I will stop sharing. So I'll give everyone a couple of minutes to answer this question, and I'll introduce you to my puppy dog as you're doing that.
Oh, wow. Is it new? You just got him?
Yeah, he's only 3 months. 3 months old? Yeah, 3 months old.
Wow, so
Hey, hi,
cute.
Rusty.
Hello. What's your puppy's name?
Come on. Come on.
Sweet. I can start the first question. What should we do to overcome an issue when your supervisor is the one that's hiding and avoids the, try to find the roots of the conflict and the problems?
That's a really great question. Yeah, look, I think, this is one of the first things I think I would do is if your main supervisor is hiding from you, then the first thing to do is then reach out to your associate supervisors or your secondary supervisors and, find out what the issue is. I think this is why, setting up when we were talking about supervision, I think it was the first or second meeting that we had, we talked about how to manage the supervision panel, and we said, it's important that we set up the rules early on, and we talked about the Graduate Research School compact, that people got their supervision compact. So it's important to set that up early, and then then you don't get into bad habits. You don't get into things where you go, well, yeah, they cancel meetings all the time, but I suppose that's just how it happens. You need to make sure that you avoid that.
Okay. So the next one is that, this pandemic situation in the sector now, what can you advise if I lost one of my supervisors lost their jobs?
Yeah, look, that's really tough. The pandemic is just been really, obviously, created havoc everywhere. Look, the university has an obligation to make sure that you have appropriate supervision, and so what you need to do is to speak to your school or institute associate dean or high degree by research director, and ask them and say, look, I feel that the supervisor, I need a replacement supervisor, they are. You need to find one. It might be simple that one of your associate supervisors can step in, but you need to make sure that that you have appropriate supervision, and it's the university's responsibility to make sure that happens.
We have one about when it's not clear to me when you're submitting a draft of your thesis or a draft of a manuscript, but basically one of the reviewers from Western Sydney basically said it wasn't PhD level work, that particular type of work. And then the person talked to their supervisor and they admit that they probably should have talked before they sent the manuscript in. And the supervisor said, "Oh, just ignore them because what you're doing it's a different discipline." So how do you deal with that setback? Do you take comments like a face value, or do you have to manage them with your supervisor's massage?
Yeah, look, I think that's a really good point. I think the way that people review work varies, and I think some people, when they do review and give you feedback, they're not always generous, and I think that's unfortunate. Someone just turning around and saying this is not PhD level work is not appropriate. I don't think is appropriate level to review someone's work. I think what they can do is say this work needs to be strengthened in this way, and provide advice how they can strengthen it. Now, what's important is that we do have different disciplinary requirements, and that sometimes those disciplines will be very, very will look at things very differently. So, for example, one time I marked a PhD thesis that was written by someone who was undertaking from the School of Engineering, but she was undertaking a humanities-based thesis from an engineering perspective, if that makes sense. What I did was I assessed it from the perspective of which it was written rather than assessed it from how I would have written it. So you've got to unpack those comments and see what they mean. And if your supervisor says, oh, look, that person is not, that person's giving you not great advice, and that is fair. Now, when someone's examining your thesis, your supervision panel should carefully pick them to make sure that they are from the appropriate discipline and that they have good experience in that area. They don't just randomly pick someone. And so, that person should look at it from that perspective. But it is frustrating, and sometimes reviewers are just horrible, and we have to learn. Unfortunately, not everyone's generous, and and not everyone's generous, and sometimes people give bad feedback, bad comments, mean comments. Unfortunately they hurt, but we need to learn to deal with them. What I personally do if I'm giving someone feedback, I give them constructive feedback, and I avoid saying silly things like this is not PhD level, because that's kind of a meaningless comment.
Okay, so here, this one, how to find the balance between during pandemic, if it's not possible to meet with friends and Zoom meetings cannot really replace the real experience, and the family being overseas, and also I kind of struggle with working from home a lot. It's really hard to focus and find that balance. Is there any tips on that point?
Yeah, that's really hard. I think we've all faced that challenge. Look, I mean, the way I've been dealing with it is to have set work times, to kind of go, okay, I'm going to work from, I have a routine in the morning. I get up, I make myself a coffee, I read the paper, I, check up Facebook and Twitter and play a little bit around on the web. And then I work through until from 9 till, from 8:30 until 10:30, I stop, I have a coffee. And then I, start working again 15 minutes later, have a 1 hour break, so I try and break the day down into parts. And I think it's really important. That's what I mean about rewarding yourself. Look, it is tough having people away. And I know myself how hard it is not being able to visit my family. And yeah, I mean, if unfortunately Zoom is what we have to do. And that's the closest thing. But I advise you to set parameters, set goals, and work around them. Don't just aim to work non-stop 24 hours, because no one can do that. And especially working from home, it's even harder, because, like I said, you haven't got the people around you to motivate you.
And Susan is doing the Shut Up and Write, which are very successful. So you can just log in anytime during the sessions. I think it's 2 to 3 times a week, and you have 5 or 6 people just writing at the same time, and then you have a 2-minute conversation, then you write again for 10 minutes, and it's very, very good. I use it sometimes.
Yeah, I think, like Susan's writing groups, writing circles, and Shut Up and Writes, even online, they're amazing. So I really encourage you to don't, the easiest thing is to feel alone. So don't feel alone.
So I have a question about the, it's not the imposter syndrome, it's the parenting syndrome. So if I have a 13-month-old, and everyone else around me is not a parent or is not a carer of a child, and they're full-time and I'm just part-time, I feel like I cannot catch up. I cannot compete with these people. Is there any strategies I could use so that I'm not feeling like I'm failing?
Yeah, look, that's a really important point. And I think there are groups, PhD groups of new parents, and I suggest you reach out to some of those. They will definitely provide you with some support and some structures. The issue is one that you can't, I mean, it's easy to say, right? What I'm going to say is going to be really easy for me to say, but you really can't compare. Every situation is contextualized. And so, we need to kind of put the situation that we're in the context of our reality. And so it's hard to, you should try not to compare yourself as you know, at any point, because, you know, there are people, you know, like I look at people and I think, oh my God, how do they do all that writing? How are they so productive? How do they achieve all those things? They're amazing. I need to be more like that. And then I'm like, no, that's them. I'm me, you know, like, let them do them. You got to do me. We work at different paces. What I really suggest that you do is find those support groups, link in with Susan, get support from Susan as well. She can direct you. And then at the same time, what you want to do is really concentrate on the quality of the work that you do, rather than the speed of the work that you're trying to achieve.
What should I do if my supervisor always ignores my emails or replies me in a very late time, which delays my research progress?
Yeah, that's a really tough one as well. I think if this is happening on a regular basis, then what I think you really need to do is to really meet with your supervisor and find out why this is happening. You know, you really do need to say things like, so you really do need to sit there and think of things like, you know, work out what the best communication strategy is. And so they might turn around and say, well, you know, I'm delayed because, you know, this part of my semester is really bad. Like, I'm just really busy at the moment because it's the end of semester and this and that. And so you got to raise your concerns and say, look, I'm not getting feedback. What do you need from me to make you know your supervision easier in a way, right? So, like, as I said, the way I as a supervisor do it, and sometimes I'm guilty during times of the semester where I can't you know, don't respond as fast as I should. One of the things you want to do is turn around and say, well, you got to give me stuff at least a week beforehand, and then I will provide you feedback within a week, right? And so it's important to kind of set up those moments of you know, to set up the agreed communication protocols. If it continues to happen, then you might want to, you should probably speak to one of your associate supervisors or secondary supervisors and just say, hey, look, you know, I've noticed that, you know, James is taking a long time to get back to me. You know, I've reached out and asked him, you know, if I can do something. He still hasn't responded, you know, and I'm really concerned here. Can I seek some advice from you? So just, you know, so yeah, so don't just sit there and sit at home and freak out and panic. Think about what you can do.
So I have three questions that are quite similar. So I'm just going to rephrase them. But at the same time, I'm also going to put the, speaking of feedback, I'm going to release a poll that you guys, the participants, can give us some feedback. So the question is the following. What if it's not your fault when all these setbacks are happening, when it's actually your supervisor or worse, your HDI director, or just generally like research people at the university level? And when you try to approach people and tell them your personal opinions about what's happening in your feelings, they just project onto you and you know, you can see that power imbalance and you feel it. How do you respond, or should not respond? What can you do, considering that you're just a student at the end of the day? Yeah. I should rephrase, maybe not just a student, but you are a student.
Yeah. Look, I mean, that's a tough one. Look, to turn around and say that, you know, you're never given bad advice or your supervisors don't make errors, you know, that's not true. Obviously, you know, because I know that I've made mistakes as a supervisor and gone, oh man, like I shouldn't have done that, and then gone back and spoken to the candidate I've been supervising, and we've talked through what, you know, how we fix that. But if you feel that what you're experiencing is structural. So one of the first things to do is I would speak to some of the other PhD students around you and see what they feel, right? And see if they sense that things are structurally wrong and you're not feeling supported, or there's there's problems in the integrity of the process. And then that's one thing. The second thing to do is, it's not a bad thing to reach out to the Dean of Graduate Studies and ask like the Dean for some advice. Speak to the Dean informally and in confidence, and say, look, these are some of the issues, some of the challenges that I'm seeing. The Dean then, sometimes there are issues which you may not know about. Sometimes, you could be misreading a situation. There's a whole bunch of things that can be involved at this point. But again, I think, there's multiple avenues. And if you feel that you can't go to the Associate Dean of Research or the HDR Director, if you feel that you can't go to one of the other Associate Deans or the Dean, then reach out to the Dean of Graduate Studies and make an appointment and raise your concerns, and see, say, look, I've discussed this with other students, and we all feel that this is happening, and we're really concerned about the direction of our candidature, and we don't know what to do, and and then if it's the university needs to respond if it's something structural like that. I hope that made sense. Yeah.
And I think also keeping notes of what's happening. So just writing down in a notebook that you have what actually happened, the date and the people involved. So if you don't have a record of what happened and you feel, for example, harassed or anything else is happening, or your supervisor has this idea, then you go do this idea, and then you come back and your supervisor said, I never told you to do that. That's a stupid idea. Then you can always have notes to point out what happened, because supervisors, administrators, everyone is human. They can make mistakes. But if something is systemic and it's affecting your mental health, at the end of the day, having notes will help out. Now, if it's actually GRS is part of the problem is one question. One thing we have is the HDI representative to the Senate. Yeah. So the academic Senate is responsible ultimately for how the university is run. You can reach out to the HDI representative, not only in your school, but the actual Senate, and raise those issues, and those can be debated across the entire Senate. So but for that you need documents to actually explain what's happening in a kind of cool manner, right, James?
Yeah, I think it's really important, and I think Alex's advice about keeping records, and that's why I always say, when we're talking about managing a panel, it's always really important to keep records of your meetings and to then send them through to your panel and say, look, this is what we agreed upon. And that's, really important that you always keep those records and then send them through and turn around and say things like, okay, we agreed that this was going to happen now. I'm going to do this, you're going to do this, and this was the agreement. And so it's documented. I think it's really important that we document like that.
So the last question is that what if I think my research data can answer my research question, but my supervisor thinks, what if I don't think my research data can answer my research question, but my supervisor thinks it can?
Yeah, look, that both the way you asked the question the first time and also the way you asked it the second time happens a lot, right? Like, research data is research data, and sometimes you think, I want to interview 10 people, and other times you think your supervisor says, oh no, you only need to interview 4 people, and I would suggest that that this is where you can speak to your panel and raise your concerns, even if just confidentially or informally, to sit around and say, hey, look, I've collected this data. I don't feel like it's enough. James says that he thinks there's enough data here, but I'm concerned. What's your opinion? What's your perspective? Do you think it's enough? And if they say, yeah, I think it's enough because of this, and then be prepared to stand up for it and say, well, I think I need more data for these reasons, and explain it, and then they should be able to respond to that. Ultimately, your supervisor should know, ultimately, what the data set should look like, or, how much data you need. But if you're not sure, then yeah, seek further advice. I think it's really important. And as Alexi said, we're human and we make errors. and if you're not confident that you've got enough data, then really make sure that you find out if you do.
Oh, there's something in caps. What do you do when your supervisor expects you to know everything, even when you're still starting out?
Yeah.
And they basically overload you.
Yeah. Look, I mean, it's a bit hard to comment on that one because people have different supervision styles, right? You know, my supervisor tended to when I did my supervision, that was my supervisor approach. He tended to dump a whole bunch of stuff on me and just assumed that I knew everything. And so I felt really overwhelmed all the time. And then, and it kind of, in a way, it was his way of, of getting me to make some progress quite quickly. If you are feeling overwhelmed, then you need to kind of make that clear. Just kind of saying, hey, look, I'm a bit overwhelmed with all this information. Can you give me an extra couple of weeks to digest it all and get back to you, and do it that way. And if that's how you feel, that's important that you communicate that. I feel. I look, like I said, everyone has different supervision styles. That's not my style. I don't do that. I have a different style to that, but that's what some people do. And for some people that's worked. They say that motivates or encourages the students or pushes. It acts as a, tough love, so to speak. It's not one that I like or I endorse, but you just need to be honest and say, this is how you're feeling. Look, often when you do your PhD or you're starting a master's project, often what happens is you're entering an area that you might not know a huge amount about. So when I started my PhD, I hadn't done a whole bunch of work. I hadn't really worked my previous disciplines weren't in sociology or philosophy. So I had a lot to learn from those perspectives. I had a lot of catching up to do. And one of my students, one of my students I'm supervising now, one of my candidates, she's got this amazing background, for example, in education, but she hasn't got a lot of time hasn't done a lot of work around the cultural study discipline. And so one of the things that it took her a while to do is to catch up on that. And I think it was important that that I provided her support as she was doing that, not making her feel like she's that you should never feel like you're dumb because you haven't got it straight away, because we just need to catch up. We need to you need to get your head around it. And so that's really, really important. So yeah, so you should not be scared to say, I just need an extra couple of weeks to get your head around it. If you feel that it's continuing to happen again, feel free to speak to your secondary supervisors, ask other students for help and see what they're doing and if they're having similar experiences. Think about your strategies, to deal with that.
One trick is to create a time plan and say, okay, you told me to learn X, Y, Z, A, B, C, D, E, F. I've mapped out, 2 weeks for each one. Look how it looks. And, you told me to do the COC here. What you're suggesting is great, but it doesn't actually fit. So we need to negotiate and reduce some of your requirements. Because this is the toolkit that you're going to use when you go get a job later on, right? In professional life, where you're going to have managers and executives telling you to do things and you just can't do it because it's not realistic. James, you have experience in the professional world, right? In banking.
Yeah, exactly right. It's exactly how it is, right? And that type of managing timelines and sort of agreeing on those, helps you get there. I mean, I think the other thing is too is there are certain things that come more naturally to us than other things. So for some people, things like writing the literature review they find it really hard because it's the first time they might be engaged with a lot of this literature, and other times it's different. It's like, people find that really easy and they find other things hard. And so you also need to expect that sometimes some things that other people might do fast, you do slower, or you might do other things fast, So but those types of timelines help you be realistic, and especially as you move along, because, you know, in your head, you might go, okay, I'm just going to read, I want to read and analyze 3 articles a day. And what you end up doing is you end up going, okay, well, I sometimes can do 3 articles a day, but there's other times it takes me 2 days to do 1 article because of the quality of the article. So then you don't sit there and say, well, that means 15 articles a week. You go, okay, I'm going to do 7 articles. And if you do more than that, then it's a bonus. If you do less than that, well, then you again reassess. Am I just did I have a bad week? Or is it just, am I overreaching? You know, so again, you got to think about what you're trying to achieve and keep a timeline on it. You know, especially, you know, if English isn't your first language and you're doing a PhD, you know, things do take longer to get your head around. And so again, be realistic, be realistic, but don't feel that you're on your own. That's really important. There are people that have gone through this. You know, I'm not sure if I told you this story, but one time, I think I was like halfway through or towards the end of my 2nd year, and I was really, I walked into my supervisor and I said to my supervisor, so before I tell you that, before I continue, so you can imagine that before I did my PhD, I worked for 10 years in finance, and then I used to work for human rights organizations for like 5-6 years, and I ran human rights organizations in Australia and all around the world. And so then I'm doing my master's, and then after my master's, I did my PhD. And about 2 years in, I walked into my supervisor and I'm like, I sat down and I said, okay, I'm going to quit. And he's like, looks at me and goes, what? I said, I'm going to quit. I've had enough. I can't do this. It's too much. I'm overwhelmed. And he started laughing, right? He's laughing. He's laughing. And I'm like, this is serious, man. Like, I can't do this. I suck. You know, this sucks. My writing's bad. I just cannot do this PhD. And he looked at me and he said to me, you know, James, I'm sorry, I shouldn't be laughing. I'm sorry. But the thing is that I've been supervising for 30 years, PhD students. And every now and again, I meet someone like you who is really accomplished before they start their PhD. And I always look at them and think, this is going to be the one candidate who's going to go through without having a breakdown, you know, without having that moment where they want to quit, right? And I always assumed that was going to be you because you always seem to deal with things with good spirit, right? He goes, but all I can say to you is you're not going to quit today, because the conversation you've just had with me, I've had with every other student I've ever supervised, right? And so you're not alone. And it's like when you watch other people do driving tests or whatever it is that you're doing, you know, what you're experiencing now, 99.9% of the time somebody else has experienced. Imposter syndrome, frustration, feeling lost, feeling that you can't do it. And, you know, and I bet you that I had all those emotions. There's nothing you're probably experiencing now that I didn't go through when I was doing my PhD. And so I think it's that the reason I share that is to say to you, you're not alone, right? And that's really important. That's the reason for these workshops, is to make sure that you don't feel alone, that you feel that we're part of this journey, and people are going through what you're going through or what you've been through, and others are going through what you will go through later. So and that doesn't mean that you should just accept feeling bad. It just means that you should reach out when you are feeling something. Don't just sit there and think, I'm the only person to experience this.
So we're running out of time, and the last question is similar. They just says they cannot negotiate with the supervisor don't want to negotiate. The advice is always go to the Associate Dean of HDR, and if that doesn't work, go to Caroline Smith, the Dean of the GRS, and basically explain the problem, showing that you've tried your best and it just is not happening. And then their job is to find a way to walk around it, not you, if that is such a big problem. So thank you for the last question. But we have run out of time and we all have to go to our next one. And James is extremely busy these days. So thank you so much for being here. And we will see you in the next, which is the first Monday of the month.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good one. And let's keep in touch. Bye now.